This is Bill Tinglin with Tour for Tolerance, proud sponsor of this podcast series on the Holocaust. Get ready. This week we take another powerful deep dive into history's darkest hour.
All right, let's dive into a chapter of history that often gets overshadowed, the interwar period. It's that period between World War I and World War II, and I think a lot of people just see it as a pause between these major global conflicts, but you and I both know there's so much more to it.
Yeah, it's definitely more than just a break.
We're going to be looking at, how the fallout of World War I, how that led to the Great Depression, how kind of desperate times, I guess, allowed some pretty dangerous leaders to emerge, and how all these global tensions that were like simmering under the surface eventually just boiled over into another world war.
It is wild, how after the devastation of that First World War, everyone was so hopeful for like stability and peace.
Yeah.
And everyone wanted prosperity, of course.
Of course.
But then the world gets hit by all these crises, one after another, and it's like it paved the way for another massive conflict.
Yeah.
Really makes you think about, how fragile peace really is.
Yeah, it's almost like this domino effect, right? One thing leads to another, and it all begins with that post-war hope just evaporating as the Great Depression sets in. I was looking at some of the sources for this deep dive, and wow, they really don't sugarcoat the impact it had on people. It's like widespread unemployment, families struggling to just, survive day to day, and there's this feeling of hopelessness just like everywhere.
And it's important to remember that the Great Depression, it wasn't just some random economic downturn. Like, yeah, the 1929 stock market crash, that was definitely a trigger. But there were these deeper issues, like these underlying problems that created this global crisis.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the crash kind of exposed those problems that were already there.
Exactly. And in the U.S., all this economic turmoil led to some pretty big shifts in how the government dealt with these kinds of crises.
Yeah.
Like, think about President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal.
Oh, yeah.
That was a totally new approach.
The New Deal, I remember learning about that in school. It was all about, creating jobs through these big public works projects. So like building dams and bridges and roads, just anything to get people back to work.
Exactly. It was all about getting money back into the economy.
Yeah.
And, providing relief for all those families that were struggling. But, the New Deal, it wasn't perfect.
Right.
It definitely had its critics, it created jobs, millions of them, but it didn't really address the systemic inequalities that left a lot of marginalized communities behind.
Right. So a step in the right direction, but maybe not a complete solution. It's interesting, though, how even with these efforts, the world was still on edge, and things were about to get a lot more complicated.
And this is where we see things start to, take a darker turn. All that economic hardship we were talking about. Well, that, combined with all the political instability, it really created the perfect environment for some pretty extreme ideologies to take root and spread.
Yeah, you're talking about figures like Hitler and Mussolini, right?
Exactly.
It's kind of mind-blowing how in the middle of so much chaos and uncertainty, these leaders were able to gain so much power. Like, what was it about their ideologies that appealed to people? What were they tapping into?
Well, they were really good at taking advantage of people's desperation,
Yeah.
people's disillusionment. I mean, after years of hardship, they swooped in with promises of return to national pride,
Yeah.
And they offer these seemingly simple solutions to really complex problems. Hitler's Nazi ideology in Germany, Mussolini's fascism in Italy, it really it resonated with people who were yearning for stability, for a sense of belonging, for something to believe in.
Okay, let's break that down a little bit. What exactly did these ideologies stand for? I remember fascism was all about nationalism, but what else was at its core?
You're right, extreme nationalism is a key part of it. But fascism, it goes beyond just, loving your country. Mm-hmm. It's also about authoritarianism, complete control, and this idea that your nation is superior to others. It rejects democracy, it crushes individual liberties, and it elevates the state above all else.
So basically it's about total control by the state and the idea that one nation or group is just inherently better than others. How did that play out in Germany and Italy? Did people just accept these ideas without question?
Well, a lot of people were really drawn in by the promises of stability, of national revival. They were told things would get better.
Right.
And in both countries, we see the rise of single-party states, the suppression of anyone who dared to disagree, and a really rapid militarization. Hitler's Germany, especially, they took this idea of national superiority to a whole other level with this idea of racial purity.
Right.
Which as we know, led to the persecution and ultimately the genocide of millions of Jews and other minorities.
It's chilling how these ideologies that emerge from economic despair and political instability could lead to such horrific consequences. It's a stark reminder of what can happen when fear and desperation take hold. But it wasn't just fascism that was gaining traction during this period, right?
Right.
What about communism? How did that fit into the picture?
Yeah, communism was offering a very different vision. It emphasized a classless society, collective ownership, and this idea of a worker-led revolution.
Right.
It presented itself as a radical alternative to both capitalism and fascism. But in practice, communist regimes like Stalin's Soviet Union, they also became incredibly dictatorial, suppressing individual freedoms and carrying out these brutal purges to eliminate any perceived threats.
So both fascism and communism, even though they came from these very different ideological starting points, they ended up with these similar patterns of authoritarianism and suppression of individual liberties.
Yeah, that's a really important observation. It shows us that ideologies by themselves, they don't guarantee a just or equitable society. It's how those ideas are put into practice, the power structures that are created that really shape people's lives.
It's a good point. It's so easy to get caught up in the rhetoric, but we have to look at the reality of how these systems actually work, how they impact people. So, okay, we have this backdrop of economic turmoil, the rise of extremist ideologies, and this growing sense of anxiety around the world. It feels like, everything is about to explode. What were some of the conflicts that really illustrate the world sliding towards another war?
Well, the 1930s, they saw a bunch of conflicts that were like these ominous preludes to the global catastrophe of World War II. Like, for instance, the Russian Civil War, which broke out after the fall of the Tsar. It really demonstrated the chaos and the power vacuum that can happen when a regime collapses.
Yeah.
You had all these different factions fighting for control of Russia, and the fighting was just brutal.
And then you have the Turkish War of Independence, which resulted in the establishment of modern Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. It's a really powerful example of a nationalist movement that reshaped the world map after the collapse of these big empires. It's interesting to see how these events were basically redrawing the lines on the map, changing the world order.
Totally. And we definitely can't forget about the Italian conquest of Ethiopia in 1935. It was a blatant act of aggression by Mussolini's Italy. And it really exposed the weakness of the League of Nations. I mean, they were supposed to prevent this kind of conflict, but they failed. It's a tragic example of what happens when unchecked ambition meets ineffective international institutions.
It's like the whole world was watching this aggression unfold and no one could or would stop it. And then, of course, there's the Second Sino-Japanese War, which started in 1937 with Japan's brutal invasion of China.
Right.
That conflict kind of foreshadowed the horrors of World War II. It showed just how far Japan was willing to go to achieve its imperial ambitions in Asia. It's like each one of these conflicts chipped away at the already fragile peace, making another war almost inevitable.
Exactly. And speaking of foreshadowing, there is one conflict that really stands out as like this chilling preview of the ideological battles and global power struggles that were about to engulf the entire world.
You're talking about the Spanish Civil War, right?
Yeah.
I've always been fascinated by that conflict, but it's also, incredibly tragic.
Oh, absolutely.
Just a lot of suffering.
The Spanish Civil War, which lasted from 1936 to 1939, it was really like a microcosm of this larger ideological struggle that was happening all over the world. On one side, you had Francisco Franco and his nationalist forces backed by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy.
Right.
And then on the other side, you had the Republican government.
Yeah.
Who had support from the Soviet Union and all these international volunteers who came to fight in the international brigades.
It's heartbreaking to see how a conflict in one country became this battleground for all these global ideological and geopolitical forces.
Yeah, it really was. And the Spanish Civil War, it was like a testing ground for these new weapons and military tactics.
Oh, wow.
It was like a preview of the horrors that would soon engulf the world in World War II. Just imagine the Spanish countryside transformed into this brutal laboratory where the weapons of modern warfare were being developed and refined.
It makes you wonder if things could have gone differently. Like, could World War II have been prevented, or was it just, the inevitable outcome of all the choices that were made during those years between the wars?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a question historians have been grappling with for decades. I mean, we can't go back in time and change what happened, but studying these events, it can give us some really valuable insights into the forces that shape our world. It helps us understand the consequences of our actions,
Right.
and the importance of protecting peace and democracy.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history isn't just these like dates and facts you read in a textbook. It's like this living narrative that still shapes our world today, shapes our present and our future.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And as we wrap up this deep dive into the interwar period, I want to leave you with this thought.
Yeah.
This era, it was a time of immense suffering, of just, unimaginable loss.
Yeah.
But it was also a time of incredible resilience,
Yeah.
of innovation, of human courage. Even in the darkest of times, there are always glimmers of hope,
Right.
people who stand up for what's right, movements that are striving to create a better world.
It's inspiring to remember that even in the midst of all the turmoil and tragedy, there were those who never gave up hope.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that that we can learn from the choices that made, the paths not taken, the consequences that followed.
Absolutely. History isn't just about remembering. It's about learning
Mhm.
and applying those lessons to create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
For anyone who wants to, keep exploring this fascinating and complex period, there's so much more out there to discover. You could take a deeper look into the Treaty of Versailles and how that impacted post-war Germany, or maybe explore the long-term consequences of all these conflicts that erupted during this era. The more we understand the past, the better equipped we are to face the challenges of, the challenges of today and the future.